you, John. Thank you, Mark. Thanks for having me here. And in 45 minutes, we're going to be covering the future of trains. We have a handout for everybody, so if you don't have one of these, raise your hand and we'll get you one. Got a couple in the back there. And then at the end of the presentation, if you want a complimentary book, we'd be glad to give you a complimentary book. Let's just do that. Thank you. So if you're not familiar with this picture, this is a picture of spring. That's what spring looks like. But also, the guy who took the Den is here. He took the picture, so that's pretty cool. Here's the agenda for the next 45 minutes. We're going to review why train ridership is increasing. We're going to talk about the end of the auto age, the future of trains, and then as much or as little Q&A as we can get in 45 minutes. I'm wearing the bowler hat today in honor of the last century and this century. 100 years ago, you could tell how much money a man made by the kind of hat that he wore. Rich people wore this hat, the top hat. This is actually my father's top hat when he was at the University of Wisconsin and a student there. They wore tucks and tails and went out dancing on Saturday night. If you haven't been on campus recently, they don't wear these much anymore. But most people were not rich. Most people were working men, and working class men wore this hat, which you're familiar with. But the middle class was just emerging 100 years ago, and it was the middle class that made America strong, and the middle class that we're reviving now, 100 years later. But it was the middle class that created the industrial age, and the age that you and I grew up. And the first year of the industrial age, when we were fully in the industrial age, out of the agrarian age, was 1920. And it's no coincidence that 1920 was also the founding year of the National Football League. My favorite team even named after the factory. And so the industrial age formed not only our economy, but also our way of life and what we value. 100 years later, we are again going through this enormous economic transformation, and a new class is emerging. And this new class is the class that is driving ridership in trains. Just a brief about me. My great-grandfather came to Milwaukee from Germany and was what we would call today an entrepreneur. Back then they were called industrialists. And all of his inventions or companies went bankrupt, except one, and that was Rexnord, and that became a Fortune 500 company. And allowed my grandfather to have a home on Belumda outside of Oconomowoc in Lower Genesee Lake. I grew up in Fond du Lac. My father was managing editor of the Fond du Lac Commonwealth Reporter. And I live in River Falls, have lived in Madison, Milwaukee, and have a cabin in Presque Isle. My son, William A. Draves V, grew up in River Falls. And like most of Wisconsin's young folks, has left the state for where the 21st century is taking place. One of those places is Portland, Oregon. I, again, grew up in Fond du Lac, and this is a map, a road map of the area, but all railroads. In 1932, those were all railroads. One of the things I do as one of my part-time jobs, doesn't pay anything, but nevertheless we predict the future. And so 10 years ago, we wrote a book called Nine Shift, Work, Life, and Education in the 21st Century, in which we predicted what the major changes would be in this century in the United States in our way of life. All of those predictions have come true. And just a couple of highlights. In 2005, we predicted that train ridership would increase and the sale of new cars decline. And Peter Day, the BBC global business reporter, flew from China to River Falls to interview us. It was a great honor. I'm not sure how many people go from China to River Falls, but that was great. We predicted the Great Recession, and that was published in the New York Times in 2006. But then in 2008, I keynoted a train conference in Milwaukee. It was a national train conference, but it was held in Milwaukee. The other keynoter at the conference was Congressman Petrie. And I predicted that young people would stop driving. And back then, even trained people didn't believe that would be happening. And so one train guy from Illinois came up afterwards and he says, "You're predicting this, but prove it. Prove it, Draves, that young people are not driving." So that set me off on this quest to prove that young people are not driving. And of course, I emailed all the auto companies. They knew nobody was buying cars who were young, but they weren't going to tell me. Emailed all the auto experts. They had no idea what was going on. Finally, a government guy actually emailed back from Washington, D.C. and said, the DOT transportation survey coming out in January 2010, the date is there. And we went on it, and we were the only people to see it generationally. But we saw that Generation Y, which is millennials born between 1980 and 1999, were indeed driving 37% less than you and I when we were that age. And so we got interviewed by Advertising Age and then by Kiplinger's. And then one day in the fall, my co-author Julie Coates came in and said, the Kiplinger story has been picked up by Yahoo News. And me, being fairly clueless, said, okay. And she said, you don't understand. More people read the Yahoo News than the New York Times. And I said, oh, really? And within hours, national media picked it up. And so on Monday, when Yahoo News carried the story, nobody in America knew that Gen Y was driving less than our generations and other generations. But then it got picked up by Forbes, The Atlantic, all sorts of media, one in French, one in Spanish. And by the end of the week, everybody in America knew that Gen Y was driving less. And all that came out of a train meeting in Milwaukee, so I was very grateful for that opportunity there. Well, I grew up in the state of Wisconsin, and I live in Wisconsin now, but for 22 years I lived in the state of Kansas. And I don't know if you know this, but to gain residency in the state of Kansas, you have to take a class on the Wizard of Oz. So I signed up for my class on the Wizard of Oz, and it turns out that the Wizard of Oz was written 100 years ago, in 1900. Now the movie with Judy Garland came out in 1939 and premiered in the city of Oconomowoc. Very good. Let's give him a round of applause. I don't know if you want a book, but yes. You're the first person who's ever known that. That's amazing. Thank you. But the book by L. Frank Baum was written 100 years ago. And Baum lived in a different world. And he lived in an agrarian society. And his society was being changed. It was being destroyed. And he was totally opposed and aghast about that. He did not call it the industrial age, but it's the age that you and I grew up in and are totally comfortable with. But to Baum, this was destroying the highest civilization, a greatest state of morality. Everything held dear was being destroyed. And he said it in Kansas. He had never been in Kansas, but just 15 years earlier, Horace Greeley, a New York newspaper man, wrote, "Go west, young man." And back then, people actually believed New York journalists. And so 1 million to 1.5 million people moved to Kansas within just 10 or 15 years. And Baum said, even here in this wonderful paradise, this awful transition is taking place. And so 100 years later, this awful transition is again taking place. And so back then we moved from the agrarian age, where 50% of people in Wisconsin and basically America lived on a family farm, into the industrial age, where even though we are called the dairy state, we are the manufacturing state. And even though Alabama is a cotton state, manufacturing obviously outweighs all of that. And so that led to our research on what the 21st century would be about, and we wrote the book and we made the predictions, and all of the predictions have come true. So just as a preface, I'm going to make some predictions about the next 10 years, and I just want you to understand that I received my crystal ball from the man himself. And so you can be rest assured that my predictions will be coming true. What?
He's the man behind the curtain.
Yes, that's right. So the driving force literally of the last century was the automobile. The driving force of this century is the World Wide Web. There, Tim Berners-Lee, the founder or the creator of the World Wide Web. And it's led to 9 shifts. We don't have time to talk about all 9. But the essential one is time is so valuable in this century that you cannot afford to waste it. And so young people, this is all about Generation Y, because they're the ones creating this century. They're the ones born to this century. And so time is so valuable that they do everything they can to conserve it, because basically their jobs all involve business, professional kinds of jobs. They're not standing on a factory assembly line. One of the ways you conserve time is to take trains instead of cars. Cars waste 25% of people's productive time every day. And when you're making money and a business person, you cannot afford to waste 25% of your time. You cannot afford to live in a suburb, not money-wise. Money-wise, you can afford to live in a suburb, but you can't afford to waste so much time living in a suburb, driving to malls, driving to offices, and then spending your day off mowing a lawn. To us, we now embrace this, but to Gen Y, this is the most insane activity you would ever spend a Saturday doing, is mowing a lawn. And so all of these changes happen in a very short period of time.